But NATO's policy has always relied upon deterrence, the ability to mass sufficient force quickly to demonstrate that it can defend its territory and to therefore deter aggression. And NATO judges, given the increase in the perceived threat from Russia, that it now needs to have more troops in order to do that. In other words, to go from 40,000 troops at high alert to 300,000 troops. So it suggests that what was pretty unthinkable 10 years ago, unfortunately, is now in the realm of the thinkable.
Obviously, NATO is a defensive alliance, but we've heard talk from a senior British military figure talking about the possibility of the British Army needing to train to fight Russia. Is the idea of a hot war with Russia closer than it's been for some time, do you feel?
I think the answer is yes. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that a war between Russia and NATO is inevitable. And Putin, of course, has got his hands full with Ukraine at the moment, which doesn't suggest that he has either the wherewithal or the intention to attack a NATO member state. But NATO's policy has always relied upon deterrence, the ability to mass sufficient force quickly to demonstrate that it can defend its territory and to therefore deter aggression. And NATO judges, given the increase in the perceived threat from Russia, that it now needs to have more troops in order to do that. In other words, to go from 40,000 troops at high alert to 300,000 troops. So it suggests that what was pretty unthinkable 10 years ago, unfortunately, is now in the realm of the thinkable.
And does NATO, because there's some complaints have been made by Estonia, for example, that it takes 180 days theoretically for a NATO to respond to attack. If the worst ever did come to the worst, this has all been theoretical, really, since the founding of NATO, hasn't it? It's never actually happened where NATO's had to fight a foe like Russia. Do you think actually it would all work? There are systems in place that could function to deal with an attack on one of the NATO countries?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, NATO, of course, has got a lot of military planners who spend their lives thinking about this kind of thing. And what's clear is that clearly NATO has got a lot of troops, but very few of those troops are equipped and ready to move immediately. And you're right about the 180 days. When I was at NATO, that was one of the big problems. If NATO wanted to deploy even small units in Afghanistan, regiments had to go and sort of cannibalize other regiments for equipment in order to be able to have everything that they needed. But that was fine because, of course, the Cold War had come to an end. There were no major threats. There was no need to spend a lot of money keeping, like a fire brigade, NATO forces in a constant state of high alert. But that's changed now, which is reflected in, of course, all of the many exercises that NATO is holding in Central and Eastern Europe. And it has to have a greater warfighting capacity. In other words, it has to have more forces on the border, but more forces behind the border in reserve who have pre-assigned missions. In other words, if war breaks out, they know who they're going to fight and where they have to do the fighting.
Can you answer this, Jamie? Because it strikes me that one of the central problems the world is facing is that of global hunger and starvation, which will be caused by the blockade of Ukraine and the grain there. Is it in NATO's power? Should it be NATO actively doing this and talking about this today to get that grain out of Ukraine? Could there be a NATO convoy that takes it out and working on the assumption that Russia is not going to attack a NATO convoy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think NATO feels that if it takes this role on itself in the Black Sea, there is a risk of an escalation with Russia. Therefore, the solution so far is twofold. Number one, to see if Turkey, a NATO ally that also has quite good relations with Putin and has not imposed sanctions so far against Russia. We can debate the merits of that, but Turkey has at least channels open with the Kremlin, and the Turks are offering to mediate on the grain dispute and have suggested that their ships could do the escorting, particularly as Turkey has a custodial responsibility for the straits, and maybe countries, for example, like Egypt or others in Africa that are recipients of the Ukrainian grain could participate in that. That could be more politically acceptable. The other aspect of this is that the EU is working on a different strategy of getting the Ukrainian grain out over land into the Baltic states and shipping it out of the Baltic states or along the Danube. But of course, the problem there is that that's only taking a fraction of the grain, the 20 million tons that could be transported by sea. So it's much slower. And of course, getting those transport links up fully is going to take some time. So I don't think it's a NATO solution there, but certainly the countries in NATO in different sort of permutations can play a role. But of course, we need to apply more pressure on Russia to lift its blockade.
Yeah, very good point. Jamie Shea, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
He is the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General.